Welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today we interrupt your College Football 25 dynasties to bring you back to another season preview. The votes came in, and this week we have the Miami Hurricanes. Now, if you want to participate directly on the uploads you see on this channel, be sure to go to the community tab once this video is over and vote on the next season preview. Be sure to like and subscribe, and with that out of the way, let's jump right into it. What went wrong for Miami in 2023? Well, the first thing is got to be red zone defense. They allowed their opponents to score 87% of the time when they got in the red zone, which was 100th in the country. Not very good. Wasn't able to lock offenses down when it mattered. Obviously not what you're looking for if you're Mario Cristobal. Usually if you're bad on defense, you want to be bad everywhere else except in the red zone, because you can manage that. But that was not Miami last season. And another big issue for Miami was the turnovers. They averaged 1.8 giveaways per game, almost 2, which was 109th in the country. And the average turnover margin for Miami in 2023 was -0.3, which was 93rd. Miami was not able to hold onto the ball very well, and most of that was due to the quarterback and some fumbling issues, but they've got that mostly figured out this offseason, but we will get into that in a second. The last thing that went wrong for Miami in 2023 was the penalties. All around pretty undisciplined team last season. They averaged 6.2 penalties per game, which was 80th in the country, 59.8 penalty yards per game, which was 106th. And the biggest shocker to me, 9.7 yards per penalty. So they almost averaged 10 yards on every single penalty they received, which was 126th in the country. Towards the bottom of the entire nation in that stat. Definitely not what you want to see. I mean, if you're giving up a lot of penalties, the last thing you want to see is that you're giving up big penalty yards every single time. So definitely not ideal for Miami in 2023. And that's what went wrong. What went right for Miami in 2023? Well, for one, the offensive line was phenomenal. All 5 starters on that offensive line made an all ACC team in 2023, whether it be first, second, third, or honorable mention. All of them made it, and not every team could say that in 2023. Some were strong in some areas and weak in others, especially in the ACC. And with that, the pass protection was also really good. Tyler Van Dyke was only sacked 1.3 times per game. Very good numbers, tied for 17th in the country. And on top of that, Miami quarterbacks altogether were only sacked 3.6% of the time, which was 15th in the country last season. And that's the biggest knock on Tyler Van Dyke. He wasn't pressured too often, but seemed to make a lot of mistakes without pressure. Generated a lot of turnovers without necessarily being rushed that often. But besides that, the special teams unit was also very good. Kicker Andy, bear with me here, Borregales kicked for over 84.6% field goal percentage, 97.8 extra point percentage, and a long of 51. Very accurate. He was a first team all ACC kicker. Exactly what you want to see from a kicker. Doesn't really get better than that. And likewise, the punter Dylan Joyce was also really good. 2 great specialists for Miami last season. Dylan Joyce averaged 43.8 yards per punt. He had 15 down inside the 20, and over 35% of his punts were down inside the 20. And for that, he was an all ACC honorable mention. And last, for what went right in 2023, the rush defense was also very, very good. Very solid unit overall. Their opponents only averaged 111.7 rushing yards per game, which was 15th in the country. Likewise, they only averaged 3.5 yards per rush attempt, which was 20th. And to solidify that unit as one of the best in the country, they had 88 tackles for loss, which was tied for 18th in the country last year. And with 2023 out of the way, let's get into a 2024 overview. To start off, we have the schedule for Miami. It is a very interesting one, to say the least. They start off on the road in Gainesville, Florida, to play Florida. Then they are at home versus Florida A&M and at home versus Ball State. Then they go on the road to Tampa, Florida to play USF. And then back at home versus Virginia Tech. And then at California, going to have to go across the country for that historic ACC rivalry in Miami and California. And then they have a bye week, and then they go to Louisville, Kentucky to play Louisville, at home versus Florida State, at home versus Duke, at Georgia Tech, another bye week, at home versus Wake Forest, and then on the road at Syracuse. Now for ACC schedules, this one is pretty difficult. I mean, they play Louisville, Florida State, Virginia Tech, and a pretty tough non-conference opponent in Florida. Now you might hear Florida. They sucked last year. Well, their record might have been bad, but their team is still very talented. Definitely a big matchup there for Miami. That Florida defense is probably going to be pretty good this season. But the schedule is not awful overall, especially not as bad as a team like Florida's or any SEC teams or Big Ten teams. It is very balanced, home and away, 6 games each, which isn't very good for Miami. I mean, usually you want to play your toughest opponents at home and the easier opponents on the road, but they don't really get that luxury. They play Florida on the road, Louisville on the road, Georgia Tech on the road, USF on the road, and they have to go all the way to California on the road. Again, not the worst case scenario for Miami, but generally not what you want to see. And like we just said, starting off in the swamp is going to be the litmus test for Miami this season. If they come out and just stomp all over Florida, Miami's probably going to be a very, very interesting team, a potential ACC champion team. But if they come out and it's a close game against Florida, or if they lose against Florida, it could spell disaster for Miami. But no matter what, they should be able to get it together in November. That November slate is pretty easy. They play Duke at home, Georgia Tech on the road, Wake Forest at home, and then Syracuse on the road. They're going to be more talented than all of those teams. Duke is in a bit of a rebuild. Georgia Tech has a pretty good offense and a pretty weak defense. Wake Forest and Syracuse, with all due respect, are just not going to be a high caliber threat, especially against Miami in the ACC this season. So a pretty easy slate for Miami in November to counteract what should be a pretty treacherous first 8 games. And that was their schedule. Let's get into some of Miami's strengths in 2024. And for their first strength, might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but it's going to be their entire offense. That whole unit is stacked this season. First, let's talk about Cam Ward. Obviously, a generational addition for Miami quarterback we've ever seen. That's how talented he is. He's easily going to be the most talented quarterback in the ACC this season, and he should have a good case for Heisman this year. In his past 2 years at Washington State, he's thrown for a completion percentage of 65%, nearly 7,000 yards, 48 touchdowns. Amazing numbers there, and should be even better with the amount of weapons he's going to have at Miami this season. We'll get more into that in a second. Next on that offense is the offensive line. Obviously, we said they were very good in 2023, and they have 3 All-ACC linemen returning this season. Those linemen are Jalen Rivers, Inez Cooper, and Francis Maugwa. And on top of that, they add an All-Big Ten honorable mention center, Zach Carpenter from Indiana. Gonna be a good unit once again in 2024. And that's going to help what should be a very stacked running back room. Now, if you did see our top 10 offenses, you would notice that when we talked about Miami, we left off a very important transfer, and that's our fault. The depth chart website we use for some reason doesn't have him listed, but very hard to overlook the #1 transfer running back, Damian Martinez from Oregon State. He's rushed for over 2,100 yards and 16 touchdowns in the last 2 years at Oregon State, and he was an all Pac-12 first-team running back in 2023, and he's going into what should already be a very loaded running back room. They have Mark Fletcher and AJ Allen, who both combined for over 800 yards and 10 touchdowns last year, and they should all benefit from what should be a very good run blocking scheme this upcoming season. And on top of all of that, to round out that offense, the wide receiver room is going to be very, very good. In 2024, they returned 2 All-ACC wide receivers in Jacoby George and Xavier Restrepo. They combined for over 1,900 total yards and 14 touchdowns in 2023, and they add an All-Big 12 honorable mention in wide receiver Samuel Brown from Houston, who had a monster season. Should be a big target for Cam Ward. I believe he's 6'2", 205. Big wide receiver. Going to be a very reliable red zone threat to go on top of 2 very good wide receivers in George and Restrepo. And one of the more underrated wide receiver rooms in general this upcoming season. Very, very deep with talent from top to bottom. And other than the offense, the front six for Miami is going to be another strength. They returned 2023 freshman All-American and Ruben Bain was very, very good last season. He had 12.5 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks, and 3 forced fumbles. A disruptor to every extent, a game changer, and he was a true freshman last year. He's coming in as a true sophomore, should be one of the better pass rushers in the game this season. And on top of that, they add 3 defensive linemen in CJ Clark from NC State, Simeon Barrow from Michigan State, and Tyler Barron. Those 3 combined for 20 tackles for loss and 10.5 sacks in 2023. Should be a great unit all around, and they have depth. And for the linebackers, they return all ACC second team linebacker Francis Mauigoa, who had 48 solo tackles, 18 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks, an interception, and 2 forced fumbles. Another big disruptor on that Miami defense. And they return other key contributors from 2023 in Wesley Besainth and Raul Aguirre. And just for fun, they added what should be a great rotational piece in Louisville's Jalen Alderman. Saw a lot of snaps at Louisville, got a lot of tackles, not that many tackles for loss or sacks, but like we said, should be a great rotational piece. Probably won't start, probably won't see the most snaps, but he's going to be that spark plug coming in with the second unit when guys like Francis Mauigoa and Besainth get tired. And for their last strength, it's going to be special teams. We talked about how good that unit was in 2023, and they returned both of their specialists from that season in Borregales and Joyce. An amazing kicker and punter should be in store for another great season. And those are their strengths. What about weaknesses? Now, we should probably start adding a disclaimer for this segment. Just because something is a weakness doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad. These are just going to be areas where the unit might be generally worse than the rest of the team, but that doesn't necessarily make them bad. And with that, the first weakness for Miami is going to be the secondary. We don't think this unit is necessarily bad. Don't get it twisted. The unit is inexperienced, which is where we say the weakness comes into play, but it's still very talented. And they add Washington safety Michelle Powell, who was very good in 2023, should add stability to that line. And he's probably going to be the best overall player in that secondary. And for their second and last weakness, it's going to be penalties. Now, we've said penalties for other teams, but penalties are generally hard to accurately predict. With the amount of talent Miami brings in, it should be much better than it was last year. But the fact of the matter is they're bringing in a lot of transfers on both sides of the ball. Could be an issue, but could be nothing. Usually, even if a player is a junior, senior, and has a lot of experience in the sport, transferring in could lead to a bit of an imbalance for teams, which could cause a few missteps early on. And like we said, it was a big issue for Miami in 2023, but with adding that amount of experience and depth, it should help this upcoming season. We don't know, obviously, which is why we're giving it a weakness. Was very bad last season, but all things considered, should be measurably better this year. And that was the overview. Let's jump right into the final predictions for Miami in 2024. But before that, as always, let's get into some keys to success. The first key to success is going to be letting Cameron Ward work. Cam Ward has shown his ability to be an elite game manager and an elite arm talent. And with the weapons he'll have this season and the protection he'll have, it's just a matter of scheming to his strengths, which shouldn't be hard to do with the amount of talent he has. Definitely one of the easier areas, but also really important to focus on him. He's an NFL first round talent, and you shouldn't squander that by making him do stuff that he's not used to doing. And for the next key to success, it's going to be owning the line of scrimmage. Now, they did a decent job at that last season, but this season, Miami's going to have at least a top 3, if not top 2, offensive and defensive line in the ACC. So if you control the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball, you can essentially control the pace of the game. You can play exactly the game you want to play. And Miami has the opportunity to do that both ways, the same way Michigan did in the Big Ten in 2023. Obviously, probably not as good as Michigan did last season, if you forget Michigan did win the national championship. But in the ACC, should be very, very likely for Miami. And for their third key to success, it's going to be pressuring the quarterback. The ACC has some pretty good quarterbacks, but there's very few teams as balanced as Miami's going to be. And if you can get to guys like DJ, Haynes King, Grayson McCall, and Kyron Drones, you take away those teams' best chances at beating you, which is those quarterbacks. Very important that they get pressure on those quarterbacks. Not as many great running offenses in the ACC as there is great quarterbacks. And those were the keys to success. Let's get right into the final grades. The offense is going to round out to a 93.0, very good all around, but not as great as some SEC and Big Ten teams. Still very good nonetheless, probably the best offense in the ACC. And with that, the defense is going to come into a 90.0. Very good front six, like we talked about, not as good back five. Overall, probably a top 3 unit in the ACC. And as for special teams, they're going to round out to a 94.5. They have a top 2 specialist group in the ACC. Very hard to measure that up with Florida State, who they are neck and neck with. 2 great groups of specialists there at Miami and Florida State, and both pretty even, honestly. And as for coaching, Mario Cristobal and staff are coming in at an 88.5. They've been great on the recruiting trail, but they have failed to live up to the hype thus far. But this season, they look like a legitimate ACC contender and playoff contender. And they are pretty hyped every year, but this season feels a little bit different. And as for strength of schedule, that's going to come into a 91.5. Naturally, most ACC schedules won't be that bad, but for an ACC schedule, it is pretty difficult. They'll be able to feed off the bottom of that conference a good bit of the season, but they're going to go up against most of the big dogs, excluding Clemson this season. And overall, that's going to round them out to a 91.5, the second best team in the ACC in terms of overall, but definitely a contender for the conference this year. Despite that, there's going to be a lot of other factors besides just what we say their overall is this season that goes into winning the conference. So just because they're the second best team doesn't mean we think they're necessarily coming in second place. They very well could win the ACC this year. And for the final prediction, their ceiling is going to come into an undefeated 12-0 with an 8-0 conference record. And this is legitimately possible. They have their 3 toughest opponents in Virginia Tech, Florida State, and Louisville, and they're going to be on par talent-wise with all those teams and could be even better when it comes time to play Florida State and Louisville. And for the floor, we think Miami could come in at an 8-4 with a 5-3 conference record. Definitely a high floor for Miami this season, but this is also legitimately very possible. There is a world where Miami drastically underperforms compared to their talent level, which it seems they have done the past few years. We personally think Miami's going to be a lot better this year, but it feels like we've been pretty high on Miami the past few years and they haven't quite lived up to it. So this would be that scenario, still better than they were last year, so nothing to sneeze at all. But for the final prediction, we have Miami coming in at 11-1 with a 7-1 conference record. This seems like the most likely outcome for Miami, in our opinion. They're going to be more talented than most of their opponents, but an off day is probably in store for Miami at some point. They play at home versus Virginia Tech and FSU, and on the road versus Louisville. 3 very tough matches, but 2 of the 3 being at home does help them out a lot. And that's going to do it for the 2024 Miami season preview. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe. Drop a comment saying what you liked about it. Share it with all your friends, your aunt, your uncle, your sister, your nephew, all of the above. And if you disagreed with some part of the video, feel free to drop a comment saying what you disagreed with. We want to hear your feedback. And like we said at the beginning of the video, if you want to decide who the next season preview will be on, feel free to go to the community tab after this video and vote on the next team. It should be up as soon as this video goes live. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you then.